morning, TIU undergrad. I bring greetings from the church at Trinity Graduate School. Thank you for sharing corporate worship and fellowship with me today. Thank you, worship team, for sharing your gifts with us. And thank you, Stephen, for reading. So, as Felix said, I graduated from the college last year. I'm now at the grad school. I sat in those chairs for many years, and now I've moved on to sitting in those same chairs, but on Tuesdays and Thursdays instead. I am not Emily Kim, but you could call me Homily Tim, because I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I work as an assistant resident director for Carlson Hall. I'm also the graduate advisor for MUG, so it's good to see some faces that aren't exclusively male and to be able to share fellowship here as well. So we're in this series about the Imago Dei, bearing the image and likeness of God. And so far we've seen this pattern of God with these beautiful plans of relationship and community and working to serve the Lord, and we see a pattern of woeful rebellion and sin by humans. And so now we come to this point in the redemption history that God had been working, and we see one particular person being called for a specific purpose, but the goal is that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. So that is that all of the image bearers, all of the people who were made in God's image will be able to be blessed by what is happening to Abram. So with calls, we use the terms call and calling a lot in a lot of different contexts. How many of you have used the term calling to describe, like, I have a calling to education or medicine? Raise your hands. Okay, that's some of you. It's good to raise it small like this because you're not asking a question. That's okay. How many of you have used the term calling to refer to, like, well, I felt called to Trinity, like to a location, or I didn't feel called to go to this mission trip in this one place? Can you give me a thoughtful nod? A thoughtful nod. Okay, good. And how many of you have felt maybe pressured or confused by what calling means? Can you give me like a thoughtful chin stroke if you've been confused by calling and wondering what place this has in your life? Okay, I see some chins. I know you know how to use them, so I know we've all been confused by this. And so I'm sorry that has been confusing for you, and you have not had clarity on whether there has been a calling in your life or you felt pressured by this idea. Our goal today is that we would seek wisdom from the Lord through scriptures to understand the callings that we have received. So there's many different kinds of calls. Like, do any of you have one of those older relatives who now you can text, but when you text them a really simple question like, what time is cousin Susie's birthday party, they call you back immediately to give you that really short answer? 5 o'clock. Love you. How's your day? And you think that call has nothing to do with me. That was a call completely irrelevant to my life. Or, oh, sorry, I better answer this. Hello, personified sermon illustration. Oh, sorry, a cute classmate is calling. I better answer. Well, hey, cute classmate. No, I didn't already do the homework to Gen Ed 111. No, I would not be ditching my friends if I come and hung out with you in Lower Waybright and did homework with you. And no, I am not expecting that if we do homework together, somehow you'll fall in love with me. I know it hurts because we've all thought that sometimes. And then there are calls, things that we refer to as calls that maybe are not that important and that are not the be-all, end-all of our lives. Does that make sense? Okay, because it was fun for me to do that. So, calls. I can't think of a more appropriate audience for this than a college environment where we're always thinking about our majors and where we're going to go afterwards. Are we going to go back home and live with our parents? Heaven forbid. Are we going to go on to grad school or overseas? So, today, this is the perfect passage for that because we see that here Abram is being called to a specific location, vocation, things that we might be searching for, but the point is much bigger. So in this talk, when it can be confusing the different meanings of call, we're going to boil it down to little calls and big call. So the little calls would be things like where you're going to work, what you're going to study, where you're going to go, and the big call is, well, you'll see. So let's return to the text and look at some background here. This is Abraham before his name was changed. The Sarai that's mentioned in the text, that's Sarah before her name was changed. And what's interesting is the story really begins at the end of chapter 11 when it says that Abram and his father had already planned to go to Canaan, but they stopped in Haran along the way. But when God says, I'm going to show you this land, he doesn't reveal that it actually is Canaan. So that's kind of interesting. And sometimes we picture like Abram by himself because it seems so individualist that like he's calling him out of this place, but he had a huge group of people with him. In chapter 14, verse 14, when they're assembling these people for battle, we see that there are 318 men who are in Abram's household. So that's how big this group is. That's just the men who are fit to fight that are going with him from these places. And also, we see later that his nephew Lot and him had to separate because there wasn't enough space for them where they were. Yeah, looks like they had a lot of stuff and there wasn't a lot of room. Lot? I'm sorry, I won't do any more of those, probably. And so this region that this is going on is he's in Haran, which is like around the border of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. That's sadly where ISIS is doing a lot of its horrible atrocities. May the Lord bring justice and peace to that region swiftly. And so then he ends up in Canaan, and he has what might be the first theophany in the post-Eden days, that you actually saw God and interacted with some symbol of God, which is why he says that the Lord appeared to him, and then he built an altar there. So looking at this context, there are two wrong ways and two right ways to understand the call of Abram. So the first wrong way to do it is to think that it has nothing to do with you. You could think that, well, this is the Old Testament. This is about the law. This is about this physical inheritance of Israel. This is about that one nation, and this stuff is no longer relevant. Well, that is incorrect, first of all, because Abram is our spiritual forefather. This is where our spiritual family history really begins. Galatians 3, Galatians chapter 3, verse 7 says, "Understand that those who have faith are Abraham's sons." And further on in the chapter, in verse 29, it says that, "And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise." And in verse 17, our big brother Paul clarifies that this promise happened 430 years before the law even appeared at Mount Sinai. So this promise is still relevant to us, and this is where our spiritual family history begins. The Old Testament is our national history book. It is our family biography. So this is about us. The second incorrect way to view this is to think that this must be the prototype call. This is how every call in my life should be. It should be this dramatic intervention. It should be cinematic in scope. It should involve all of this narrative tension of leaving a particular place and going somewhere unknown. But that is not always the theme in Scripture. Sometimes it was necessary in extreme circumstances. Like Abram is in a polytheistic society where people aren't worshiping God. You need something dramatic to intervene there. Moses ran away because he killed someone and his people were in slavery. That's a pretty unique circumstance as well. Paul was a persecutor. That's why he needed this dramatic intervention. But looking at Paul with that experience, let's see what he says to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. I'll tell you what it says, actually. I'll save you the work. "Recalling your sincere faith that first lived in your grandmother Lois, then in your mother Eunice, and I am convinced is in you also." Which shows that there is something good about having this faith, even if you're born in a Christian family. Things like what happened to Paul, the goal of that was that this dramatic intervention would occur so a community of faith would develop. So you wouldn't need this kind of this cinematic tension because people would be raised up in the faith and people wouldn't need to have this intervention episode. So that is why Abram's call is this big moment that's building our community of faith. So there's two right ways to look at it, and one is a lot more important than the other. The first right way you can look at it is that it is a source of wisdom, encouragement, and inspiration if you do have one of these little calls in your life. If you do know where you're supposed to go, what you want to do, how you want to serve the Lord, then it is inspiring to see how the Lord was faithful to Abraham, and he'll be just as faithful to you. That Abram, through God's strength, left a place of familiarity, that he didn't always see the fruit of what was promised him, that he started something, didn't always benefit from it. For example, the only part of the promised land that Abram ever owned was his wife's grave. So this can be a source of inspiration if you find yourself called into a place where you're not seeing all the fruit that you would like in your lifetime. We see also examples from his life with Hagar and the Ishmael situation, that you were given a divine promise, but you try to make your own answer to it, and it doesn't work out. And Abraham is recorded in Hebrews chapter 11 as an example of faith that we can follow. And so if you do have a little call in your life, you feel confident in it, then yes, that's a good thing that you can turn to Abram's story and you can receive encouragement. However, a much, much more important, correct way to interpret this passage is that this is about leading to the big call. This is preparing for the big call that is not about location or vocation, but about salvation. The big call that all of these little calls are defined by, are pointing towards. That this little call of Abram going to a specific place at a specific time was to prepare the way for the people of God, to prepare the way for the gospel, to prepare the way for the family from which Christ would be born. And the great thing is when an authoritative, inspired New Testament author interprets the Old Testament for you, because that saves you so much work as a preacher. So let's turn to Galatians I'll turn for you, spare you the effort, chapter 3, verse 8. And here Paul says to us that now the scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and foretold the good news to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So the good news is the gospel, that this call, this dramatic intervention that might make us think that we're lacking this call in our lives, that nothing this exciting or big has happened to us, that was not the point. The point was that this big, dramatic, historical, rare moment happened to prepare for the gospel, the big call that has been given to all of us. So if you ever feel like someone is saying to you, what is your calling, and you think you don't have an answer, you do have an answer that is found in the call of Abram, that was pointing towards this whole time. Let's look at Hebrews 11, 8 through 10. And so this is the passage we referred to where Abram was recorded as an example of faith for us to follow. And it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and went out to a place he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed as a foreigner in the land of promise, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, co-heirs of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. In the midst of this little call, this place of Abram going to Canaan, these things that we might look up to and think that that's how our life should go, this whole time, Abram was not focused on that. He was focused on the fact that God was going to build this eternal city, this new heaven and new earth, that we would all be a part of with him. And in the gospel, according to John, chapter 8, verse 56, and this is Jesus talking to the Pharisees. He says, your father Abraham was overjoyed that he would see my day. He saw it and rejoiced. So Abram, who experienced these little calls, this divine intervention that we might aspire towards, he experienced both. He saw that, but then he foresaw that this big call, this gospel would come, and that is what made him overjoyed. That's what he was actually hoping for and looking forward to the whole time. He saw this day that we would have. He saw this big call that would be given to all of us and thought that that was bigger and more important and more to be cherished than the little call that he received or the little calls that anyone else in Scripture may have received that were only pointing towards this big one. So this shows the forethought and the foresight that God had in preparing this big call for you. In reality, he had been planning this from before the foundations of the world, but we do see these specific historical episodes where that's super abundantly clear, and we're actually at a very symmetrical time, chronologically speaking. We have Abraham about 2,000 years before Jesus, and us about 2,000 years afterwards. So look, like we're right on the ends of the scales of time there. So if you wanted to quote this sermon verbatim 1,000 years from now, it wouldn't work just for that reason. Everything else would be true, just not that part. So what I want us to reflect on is the fact that these little calls, they are important. They do point towards the big call. But if we have not received this little call yet, if you are worrying about that, if you're frustrated in that, you already have received a calling that's way bigger and that all these little calls are pointing towards. So if someone asks you, what is your calling? You can confidently say, my calling is to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, to obey him, to make disciples of all the nations, and to follow his commands. So you may encounter a little call, maybe something very specific, like going to serve in France as a missionary. It may be something more broad, like broadly speaking, I want to be a teacher or in marketing. And all of these calls are pointing towards this bigger one. So what I'd like for us to do is make a deal. that if you have this little call in your life and you are worrying about it and you are, well, maybe you like it and maybe you want to hold on to it, or maybe you're kind of scared of it, that we would make a deal that we would turn to people in our lives, people we can trust, mentors, professors, pastors, and we would ask them, do you see this big call at work in my life? Do you see that I am treating that as more important? Do you see me connecting these dots and putting this little call in its proper secondary place under this big call? And if you haven't received this little call yet, you don't know what you want to major in, or you have a major and you like the classes, but you don't know if you want to do that with your life, you don't know what you're going to do after graduation, that you would still invite these kind of people into your life and ask them, do you see the big call at work in me? Because if that is the case, then you already have the best possible calling, and there's nothing missing from your life. Not everybody is going to get something really specific, this divine intervention type thing. That is the exception rather than the norm, I think. But every single person who becomes a believer has been given this specific call, this call of salvation, this good news that God had been planning even 2,000 years before Jesus was born, even before the earth was made, before any of us fell or sinned. But most importantly, if you think that maybe you have not responded to this big call, that you don't understand what the gospel means, or you grew up around it, or maybe you've been exposed to it here for the first time, and you think that, well, I haven't really committed to it, I haven't thought about its place in my life, then please talk to me afterwards. And please talk to your professors, your coaches, your mentors within this community or at a church community, because that really is the most important thing that you could be thinking about this day for the rest of your life. That is very important, and you're really wasting your time if you're worrying about your little call and what job you're going to have and what you're going to do tomorrow if you're not addressing this big call that's already been offered to you. So what I would like for us to do is have a moment of just like silently thinking for a little bit. I would like for us not to close our eyes if you're sleepy. I don't blame you for being sleepy. College is hard, and you might not have slept very well last night. So maybe don't close your eyes if you might get sleepy, but kind of stare off into space for like less than a minute. I'll monitor the time. And think, who in your life do you know who you can talk to this week? Like in this next round of classes and meetings, a professor, a mentor, a coach, maybe a boss, maybe you work in this community and your boss is a believer, or maybe you go to a church, have a pastor, your parent, anyone a little bit older and wiser that you can say, you can ask them, do you see this big call at work in my life? Do you see me giving it the attention it deserves? And do you see me with these little calls I'm pursuing that are noble and good? Do you see me really like putting that as a secondary focus? Do you see me connecting these dots and treating it as the goal that I'm working towards? And if you need accountability specifically, like you're not going to see this person for another week, then ask your roommate, ask the person next to you to remind you. Maybe if it has to be in not the most friendly manner, to keep bugging you, to talk to them. And if you haven't responded to this gospel call yet, or you're questioning whether you've really treated it as important as it should be treated, then please reflect on that. And then when we conclude today, I would love for you to come talk to me and we can address that a little bit. Or if you do want to ask a specific question about big calls and little calls and how to figure all that out, and there isn't someone with a more urgent need of how they haven't responded to the gospel, then I would love to talk about that with you as well. So first, you guys cool with doing that, having like just a little less than a minute, just kind of thinking, staring off into space? Who in your life is an older, wiser person that you can bring into this situation? You can ask them, do you see me treating the gospel as number one in my life and as the defining, the anchor to whatever vocations and locations I pursue? All right, so we'll do that now. And I'll be thinking too, and you can hold me accountable to it as well. So like less than a minute. Let's just think together. All right, good job, guys. Wow. I mean, it's hard for me to be quiet, so like I'm really impressed with you guys who did that. Didn't have to shush anyone. All right, so you have someone in mind that you think that you know that would have the wisdom to speak into your life about this? Like, give me those knowing, like, chin strokes. Maybe that finger of accentuation, like, yeah, I've got it figured out. I know exactly what I'm going to do. Thank you. Yeah, you did that well. You could have a vocation in that, but it would be a little call, so it's not as important. So now, as we conclude this time, we're going to transition into another worship song and then the benediction, but I will be here for at least a little while afterwards. So please come talk to me, and we can talk about the gospel. We can talk about little calls. We can talk about vocations. We can make more puns about Lot's name. whatever you like, but, in certain order of priority. Maybe the salvation thing first. So now, I would love to pray for you guys and with you guys before we transition. You cool with that? You accept my blessing? Oh, thanks, guys.